As we reported, Iran and Iraq sat down today in Geneva for their first face-to-face meeting to settle the differences that have caused an estimated 1 million deaths in 8 years of war. Presiding over the talks is the Secretary General of the United Nations, Javier Pérez de Cuellar, whose diplomacy, backed by Security Council resolutions, brought about an Iran-Iraq ceasefire. This success and the UN role in other trouble spots today has brought the world body some unusual praise. Western nations critical of UN shortcomings are focusing on its successes. For a British view of the new attitude, we have this report by David Sells of the BBC.
The UN was born in June 1945 in San Francisco, a child of World War II. A good fairy did not attend the christening. From the word go, national self-interest blighted the millennial dream, and the wish was ever farther to the thought.
There were many who doubted that agreement could ever be reached by these 50 countries, differing so much in race and religion, language and culture. But these differences were all forgotten in one unshakable unity of determination to find a way to end war.
The oratory was grandiloquent, the hope vain, familiar UN characteristics down the years. The organization, at its New York headquarters, became a byword for impotence, notorious for its international bureaucracy of coddled placemen, for its biases and profligacy. Even the peacekeeping forces, lightly armed and easily trampled on, became suspect as toys of a UN establishment whose career interest lay more in prolonging policing operations than in solving disputes. And yet, with the UN now 43, in raddled middle age, the world has found it needs the old monster, warts and all.
I think one has to accept, first of all, the limitations, that the UN has no way of actually enforcing its will. It has no effective enforcement mechanism. It is an instrument of persuasion. One has to accept that. But when you get unity in the Security Council, and particularly unity between the 5 permanent members and within that, between the superpowers, then you have got very strong powers of persuasion at the UN's disposal.
What we have been seeing then, after some hefty arm twisting, is the last shots being fired in the Gulf War. Iraq has been fighting on, it's true, suspicious of Iran's good faith, but now both are agreed to a ceasefire. Iran, for its part, continued to mobilize the faithful to die at the front, but it was all a macabre charade. Iran's war effort had cracked. Hence the stunning volte-face of July the 18th, when, a year late, Iran unexpectedly announced acceptance of the Security Council Resolution 598.
It is much easier for governments in conflict to deal with the Secretary General, who is no threat to them, who has no great power status or anything like that, who is somebody who's been unanimously elected by the entire international community as head of an organization of which they are members, both Iran and Iraq, and who is an honest broker. And I think it's, purely as a prestige matter, it's much easier for governments to accede to arrangements and requests which the Secretary General makes than it is supposing they were made by one or other of the great powers or something like that.
I think the elements are, first of all, it has to be 2 countries who are not so powerful that the UN can exercise little influence on them. It has to be in a case such as I think Iran and Iraq will prove to be, one in which both powers probably have reached the end of their rope, want to find a solution or a way to bring about a ceasefire and hopefully then some way of settling their dispute, but are incapable of doing it on their own.
In 1973, at the end of the Arab-Israeli October War, it was the superpowers themselves who found the UN a useful face-saver. At one point, the Americans and Soviets were on the verge of being sucked into a direct military confrontation along the Suez Canal to underwrite a wobbly ceasefire. A Security Council resolution, for which both were grateful, bailed them out. A UN peacekeeping force did the job for them. Honor was saved.
Had the 2 superpowers arrived on that battlefield, we would have been in a very dangerous situation. the UN stepped in with a Security Council resolution which brought about a ceasefire and the interposition of UN peacekeeping forces between the two contestants. This enabled both superpowers to climb down from the rather exposed positions in which they'd got themselves. And I don't see any other agency but the UN which could have achieved that.
The UN peacekeeping force dispatched to South Lebanon by the Security Council in 1978 was handed a mission impossible. If you're not wanted on the spot, the UN task is hopeless. Sandwiched between contemptuous Israelis with their surrogate force of Lebanese gunmen and heavily armed Palestinians, the UN troops were to be constantly humiliated. The mandate had been ill-defined, the reasons for it suspect. The heady days of Korea, when a whole army had fought under the UN banner, were long gone. These UN troops were few, their weapons light.
All unnecessary debt.
For the Irish force commander of the time, a UN man through and through, final humiliation came in 1982 when the Israelis invaded Lebanon, sailing through the UN buffer zone as though his troops didn't exist. Unless the parties to a dispute consent, the UN is powerless. Earlier this year, the Greek and Turkish prime ministers, previously at odds, unexpectedly broke the ice. This meeting of the motherlands has paved the way for Greek and Turkish Cypriot community leaders to get together at UN headquarters on neutral ground later this month. It is another thaw, that in Soviet-American relations, that has transformed the world scene. And because of it, the UN has been in demand to referee a whole raft of negotiations.
I believe that during maybe 2-3 last years, we achieved some important things here in the UN. For example, this resolution 598, the role of the United Nations in the Geneva Accord on Afghanistan, you've mentioned this role. The activities of the United Nations in the Middle East, which is increasing, which increases too. It is linked with Mr. Gorbachev, with our policy of perestroika, of glasnost, but first of all, it's linked with our new of our conception of new political thinking and our new approach to the United Nations.
Obviously, a consensus between the two most powerful countries makes an enormous difference to the international climate. It removes one of the main obstacles to the functioning of the UN Security Council, which has been haunting it ever since 1945. And I think it does affect the behavior of smaller and less powerful states. If they see that as it were, the head boys are not fighting each other, but actually cooperating, they're much more likely to take a reasonable view of their own problems.
The superpower love-in has been the key to the UN's improved political fortunes and may even save it from bankruptcy. Mr. Gorbachev has agreed to pay off arrears of Soviet UN debt. All it needs now is for Mr. Reagan to follow suit. He has withheld American contributions of more than $500 million. Such has been his antipathy for UN antics. It hasn't stopped him, though, using the UN to try to end the Gulf War.
I think the much more interesting question is whether what Mr. Gorbachev has been talking about lately, about his own interest in using the UN more, proves to be the case, and I would suspect if it does, you will find the U.S. sort of in reaction there too, becoming more involved in the UN again itself. Although, let me hasten to say again, I think either new president, Dukakis or Bush, would probably be more prepared to cooperate with the UN than President Reagan.
It's a great cliche to say if it didn't exist, one would have to invent it. It hasn't done what it set out to do at the beginning, which was to deter and punish aggression by means of military power and all the rest of it. I don't believe it ever will. But as an instrument of persuasion, in a very different world to that which the drafters of the Charter envisaged, it has done very useful work. I think a lot of people now are alive who would have been dead without it. A lot of wars have actually calmed down, which otherwise would be raging. and so on and so forth. It's very easy to pick up its failures, but it has had its successes as well, and I think it is indispensable.
So here is the UN of today, future uncertain, begging bowl in hand, whilst paradoxically enjoying a new lease of life. It may not be esteemed, but it is needed, the scapegoat of nations.
The United Nations is our next focus. As we reported, the UN peacekeeping forces today won the 1988 Nobel Peace Prize. We'll talk about that in a moment with a key UN official. But the prestigious prize to one of the units of the United Nations comes at a time of renewed optimism for the entire world body, a dramatic turnaround for an organization many considered moribund. We spent the last week looking at what accounted for the UN's new lease on life. May 15, 1988, Soviet troops began pulling out of Afghanistan after an 8.5-year occupation. Enter Javier Perez de Cuellar, mediator. July 1988, in the Middle East. After 8 years of one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts of the century, Iran and Iraq agreed to a ceasefire. Enter Perez de Cuellar.
I now call upon the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Republic of Iraq to observe a ceasefire.
August 1988, a sudden breakthrough in one of Africa's longest-running conflicts, in Angola and neighboring Namibia. Enter Perez de Cuellar, mediator. And again, in August 1988, in the Western Sahara, Morocco and the Polisario guerrilla forces accepted a UN plan to end 13 years of war. Enter Perez de Cuellar, mediator. The United Nations, emerging as a major player in resolving some of the world's most intractable conflicts. This role, after more than a decade of being preoccupied with its own internal conflicts, with the United States often at the center. In what many regard as one of the lowest points of U.S.-UN relations, Deputy U.S. Ambassador Charles Lichtenstein invited the UN to move out of New York in 1983, boldly stating that the members of the U.S. mission will be down at the dockside waving you a fond farewell. The specific provocation for the remark was a testy exchange between Liechtenstein and the Soviets, but it reflected a larger frustration that had been building among critics for over a decade.
What an American has to learn at the United Nations is that when you walk in off the streets of New York, you are walking into essentially foreign territory, and you are walking into a forum which is dominated by countries that are either genuinely hostile to the United States and in some cases to the values of a free, libertarian, democratic country, or who play that game for what they feel is the national interest that they represent.
Few would disagree about the anti-Western attitude that has surfaced often in the 159-member General Assembly, the UN's main deliberative body. In one of its most controversial expressions, the General Assembly passed a resolution in 1975 equating Zionism with racism.
The UN has permitted itself, and when I speak of the UN, I'm talking here of the majority of its members, have permitted themselves to be made the captives of extremist agendas, which are promoted sometimes by the Soviet Union, sometimes by the most extreme members of the various regional blocs, sometimes by a combination of, by a coalition of such extreme representatives of the various members. Many resolutions are passed, of which the Zionism, racism is, of course, only the most egregious example, where the members of the United Nations are quite clearly engaging in rhetorical overkill, and they are venting their rage against their perceived enemies, sometimes Israel, sometimes South Africa, sometimes the West, sometimes the United States.
Former UN Undersecretary General Brian Urquhart argues that the Zionism as Racism resolution highlighted new circumstances in the way the UN operated.
Well, I think this was a very counterproductive, more or less rhetorical ploy. It didn't do any good for the Palestinians at all. And it was an example of the kind of exaggerated and unrealistic use of this very large majority in the main deliberative body of the UN, the General Assembly.
Was that the low point?
I think it was one part of the... Well, I don't know if it's the low point. I understand very well why there was this feeling of exasperation and bitterness in the developing world. After all, these are mostly countries who missed the Industrial Revolution, the biggest economic boom in history. And no wonder they find their new lot as independent states in the world difficult, and this was the expression of it.
You know, most of the countries that are said to be countries of the third world are former colonies of Western powers.
Botswana Ambassador Liguela.
The reason why they think that we are hostile is because we recognize that we are independent, we recognize that we are no longer colonies, we are not going to kowtow. We have interests which we consider to be as important as the interests of the big powers. And therefore, when we vote our own conscience and say, okay, we are going to vote, for instance, for the condemnation of South Africa, which is a friend of the West, they say, see, they are hostile.
I think that it's like the old members of a well-established club suddenly being confronted with a large number of extremely rambunctious new members. The old boys huff and puff and say, this is the way we do things, this is all terrible, particularly if the new members have a majority. And that takes a certain period of adjustment.
Ambassador Lichtenstein argues that the adjustments were those forced by Western demands for reform, spearheaded by the United States. In 1984, the United States began withdrawing and withholding monies from UN bodies and programs, charging gross mismanagement and anti-American bias. Few quarreled with the need for reform of the $800 million UN budget, but former UN Ambassador Donald McHenry argues that the Reagan administration call for reform was a thinly disguised effort to kill the organization.
I think the Reagan administration came in anti-United Nations, and they took advantage, I think, of something which is very true, that an institution like the UN and the other multilateral organizations occasionally need reform. And there were all kinds of people advocating reform, even advocates of the United Nations. But they turned the reform movement over to those who wanted to destroy the United Nations. And I would put Mr. Lichtenstein in that category. He wanted to destroy the institution, unless, of course, it ran the way he and his right-wing cohorts wanted it to run.
I don't think it's a hidden agenda at all. As a matter of fact, I think it's quite the contrary. I think the greatest friends of the UN are the leaders of the reform movement.
Leaders of the reform movement in Congress in 1985 called for reducing the U.S. share of the total UN budget from 25% to 20% and agreed to restore full funding only if the agency agreed to give the U.S. more voice over the budget. Their main complaint was that the one-man, one-vote rule in the General Assembly gave the smaller, poorer countries as much voting power as the United States, its largest donor.
What we're trying to do is to reform that process so that those countries that are paying the majority of the share at least have a voice and, in effect, have a veto on some of the wasteful spending.
Well, I don't buy that. If you live in a democracy, you will always have a situation where there is disparity in what people pay. When you live in a world community and you accept the idea that it is a community with diversity, then you try and persuade. You don't try and bully because you have more money than the rest of the international community.
UN Secretary General Pérez de Cuellar.
Well, I must say that I don't blame those who say that the United Nations needs reforms. Even before I was asked by the United Nations, the United States and other countries to start reforms and then start reducing our budget, I had done it. The problem I have with some Americans is that they sometimes have the impression that in the United Nations there is only one member country, which is the United States.
It's a matter of debate how much the U.S. pressure contributed, but budgetary reforms were instituted that in part gave the U.S. veto power. At the same time, the United Nations string of successes began fueling pressure on the United States to pay its back dues. Then, in a surprise move on September 12th, President Reagan announced that the UN had made enough progress on reforms to warrant the payment of the $520 million in past debts. McHenry, among others, thinks there was another reason for the sudden reversal.
Well, the U.S. has decided to pay up because I think the Reagan administration decided it didn't want to go down in history as having destroyed the institution.
While the reasons may be debated, the action stunned and displeased some members of Congress.
I'm not optimistic about the reforms. I think we threw in the towel in the first half rather than waiting for the game to be completed. If this budget comes through at reduced levels on a basis of consensus rather than the small countries simply controlling the process and asking for more and more money. If it's all larded up with a bunch of conference centers and other kinds of wasteful spending, then I think the United Nations is going to be in for a lot of trouble. And notwithstanding the fact that the administration has allowed this money to go forward, the Congress, both the House and the Senate, are going to be up in arms.
For its part, the Soviet Union, with arrearages of its own, doesn't agree with the U.S. approach. Soviet Ambassador Belanigov.
No, our approach was quite different. We didn't want to use any leverage against the United Nations. One of the cornerstones of our foreign policy now is that the United Nations should be strengthened. That's why we corrected our own course of action in respect of the United Nations, and we decided to pay back what we were due to pay many years ago.
It is this new Soviet attitude, coupled with the new U.S.-Soviet rapprochement, that many believe account for the UN resurgence.
Well, I think it's certainly what accounts for it is the fact that we don't find the Soviets confronting us everywhere just for the pleasure of confronting us.
It goes without saying that without the cooperation of our two countries, it is very difficult to find any solution within the walls of the United Nations.
Now, if the two biggest countries in the world have been able to reach a compromise through dialogue, what about the others, whose problems are less dramatic, less serious?
Israeli Ambassador Yohanan Bein.
Well, it can have an impact, of course, because the Soviet Union has quite a lot of influence on some of the Arab countries, especially Syria, our neighbor, which is very aggressive in its attitude. A change of attitude in the Soviet Union can definitely influence. But up to now, we don't see any signs here in the United Nations to that change.
Do you think this new relationship between the USSR and the USA operating through the Security Council will have any impact on this conflict?
Of course, I mean, there is a mechanism there. I mean, we see that, for example, the Soviet Union has been saying very distinctly that they believe that the parties to the conflict should come under the UN and, more precisely, the Security Council. I mean, the UN was established to become the debating ground, the forum for peace, and to spare us conflicts and shooting it out.
Whether the UN's new activism in world conflicts will bring it closer to its original purpose is the question many are asking inside and outside the 43-year-old world body. As part of that purpose, the UN has some 10,000 peacekeeping observers and troops stationed in trouble spots around the world. In the Middle East, India and Pakistan, Cyprus, a role that enjoys widespread support. But among those most cautious in their optimism about the UN's ability to truly fulfill its purpose anytime soon is the Secretary General himself.
We always face the same problem. The parties don't trust each other. And then we have to to fight, you know, in order to create an atmosphere of, I wouldn't say of trust, but at least, you know, that they realize, you know, that the only way of solving their problems is through peaceful negotiations and through compromise. But still, you know, the distrust is enormous.
Now a look at NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, present and future. We will do it with Manfred Werner, the new Secretary General of NATO, on his first official visit to the United States, and Senator Sam Nunn, Chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, a major American player in the present and future of NATO. They will follow this report on problems facing the alliance by Gavin Essler of the BBC.
In Washington, the signing ceremony of the NATO was created 40 years ago to check the expansion of a Soviet state which had swallowed Eastern Europe and showed no sign of letting go.
For us, war is not inevitable.
Now there are those who detect a potential midlife crisis, as new Soviet diplomatic thinking seems intent on denying NATO the old style of communist enemy whose aggressive behavior has helped keep the Western alliance together. In the past year, the impossible has become almost commonplace. The superpowers have agreed to destroy an entire class of nuclear weapons and want to cut strategic nuclear arsenals too. NATO has always argued it needs some nuclear weapons, not only because the Soviets have them, but also to deter any threat of an invasion by the overwhelmingly greater numbers of Warsaw Pact conventional forces. Yet Ronald Reagan has a dream.
My dream has always been that once we've started down this road, we can look forward to a day, you can look forward to a day, when there will be no more nuclear weapons in the world at all.
When the president spoke to Moscow students of a nuclear-free world, some defense analysts dismissed it as the fond hope of a man soon to leave office. But others argue it undermines NATO's strategy before the Soviet threat has actually diminished.
The bear may be smiling, but the bear still has all of his teeth. And although one prefers to have a smiling bear than a snarling bear, I'm quite sure that as long as his teeth are sharp, one should worry about the teeth.
Traditionally, the Warsaw Pact likes to show the world its military strength. Even if under Gorbachev, the Soviets boast a new military philosophy requiring only enough weapons for defense, not attack, NATO sees no slackening of weapons production. Every day, NATO estimates say, the Soviets complete 8 new tanks, 6 artillery pieces, and 2 new aircraft. 1 new Soviet nuclear submarine is built every 37 days. In such a world, Lord Carrington can find no place for the Reagan nuclear-free dream.
I think it's visionary because I don't believe you can do away with nuclear weapons. I mean, even if it were a good idea, once you've invented something, I don't believe you can disinvent it. But I have my doubts as to whether the world would be a safer place if you got rid of nuclear weapons, because all history shows that conventional arms are not a deterrent to war. I think that the horror of nuclear weapons is such that it has prevented war. I think you can do with very many fewer nuclear weapons, but I think it would be rather unwise to suppose you can do without nuclear weapons.
With 250,000 troops in Europe, Americans say they bear the burden, pay the price to keep secure allied nations, which have become increasingly rich and therefore could afford to do more for themselves. America spends around 7% of its national wealth annually on defense, Britain around 5%, Italy and other strong European economies just over 2%. Right across the spectrum, US politicians are arguing it is time for America to pay less, the Allies more. Michael Dukakis is the most recent to join the chorus.
The American people expect, and they have a right to expect, that our allies in Europe will bear a fair share of both the economic and military burdens of defending freedom around the world. But an effective European contribution is not measured simply in how many pounds of francs or Deutschmarks we spend, but what military capability we buy with our investment and that's important to bear in mind.
All this is more than just presidential election posturing. Americans have come to see relative stability in Europe in contrast to threats to US interests elsewhere, hence the creation of a rapid deployment force for use outside NATO, and increasing American worries about Central America, the Gulf, and the countries around the Pacific.
We have to ask ourselves very basic questions about why are we in Europe? Is the rationale that was stated in 1949 and 50 still valid? We have to ask ourselves what the reaction would be if American troops came home. We have to ask ourselves what the impact would be on the arms control process. We have to ask ourselves whether or not the Europeans would take up the slack. Would they in fact do more? There's not a lot of evidence of that.
What we mustn't do is to allow this to become a European-American row, because all of us have got to do better if we are going to keep our defenses adequate. And this applies to the Americans as much as to the Europeans. What we've got to decide is what's necessary, and then try and all do a bit more.
Problems for NATO tend to mean problems focused on Germany, the country whose past and future are at the heart of the alliance. Some Germans complain the new political realities mean America doesn't consult its allies enough, and consequently there have been moves to beef up Europe's own role. But there are specific niggles too. Why many Germans argue get rid of cruise and Pershing missiles under the INF Treaty, yet expect us to modernize short-range Lance nuclear missiles, which could only fall on German soil. Why not scrap the lot? It is, therefore, no coincidence that a German, Manfred Wörner, will take over from Lord Carrington as Secretary General next month. Wörner is the first German ever to hold the position, and he has, it is said, the skill to smooth over the diplomatic problems and keep most Germans enthusiastic about NATO. But Wörner may have to go on the propaganda offensive to counter the Soviets' arms control public relations victories.
I think most people think that Mr. Gorbachev's been making all the advances, and actually it's been us. But somehow or other, he's got the credit for it, and we really must do better.
Stand up! Peace!
When 16 different democracies expect their taxpayers to fund common defense, there are always going to be rows. The new Secretary General faces political opportunities and dangers almost in equal measure.
Thank you very much.
But the real test of Lord Carrington's successor will be in maintaining the cohesion of the alliance when Mikhail Gorbachev throws his next wild card into the arms control process, perhaps as soon as this autumn.